Continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, today we are pleased to present Patrick Hearty. Patrick was raised in Grantsville, Utah. His grandfather was a homesteader and cattle rancher, and his early years on the ranch left him with a deep love of history and strong ties to the Old West. In elementary school, he read a book called The White Indian Boy, a story about Nick Wilson, a young Grantsville boy in the 1850s. Wilson was enticed to leave his home and join a band of Shoshone Indians upon being offered a pony of his own. Nick Wilson returned home after a few years and later became one of the Pony Express riders of 1860 to 61. One might ponder if Pat might not have done the same thing as a youth with the similar promise of a pony. Pat graduated from Brigham Young University with degrees in chemistry and biochemistry. He has retired after a career as a chemist with the U.S. Department of Labor and, I hope I pronounce this right, Batteville Memorial Institute. Pat has been a member of the National Pony Express Association since 1978. He has served as president of both the Utah division and the national organization and is currently a re-ride captain in Utah, as well as the National Trails liaison. He has served on the Mormon Pioneer 150th Celebration Coordinating Council for the state of Utah, and as a member and chair of the Utah Historic Trails Consortium, along with other trail-related assignments. He is a member of the Utah Westerners and a charter member of the Oregon-California Trails Association. He lives in Grantsville, Utah with his wife, Linda. They are the parents of 4 children and proud grandparents of 13. So I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Patrick.
That's it?
That's it.
All right. Thank you, Sue. And thanks to everyone who's logged on. And a special thanks to Sue Malek for the invitation to make this presentation and also for her help in making it work. It's been a good dozen years since I tried a PowerPoint presentation, but after the description of the seminar series, this better be good, right? Anyway, we're going to talk today about 19th century communication in America, and specifically about the Pony Express. And since this is a genealogy seminar, and genealogy is about people rather than just about the events, we'll touch a little more on some of the people who made that history happen. All right. The colonial post roads were the first ways to get messages, to get the mail around. In 1633, the first official notice of postal service was given. Now, do you remember when the Plymouth colony was established, which is 1620. This is a mere 13 years later, and they were only working for postal service. The American people have always been quite a mobile group. They like to be on the move, and maybe that's why they came to this country, because they needed more room and a place where they could move. But those roads began to be established early on. By 1673, there was monthly service between New York and Boston. By 1735, the Kings Highway was completed from Charleston, South Carolina to Boston. And on these post roads now, if you visited the Postal Museum, the Smithsonian Postal Museum in Washington, D.C., it gives you a great feeling for those colonial post roads. By 1770, or in 1775, we were still under British control then. Ben Franklin was selected as General Postmaster. Ben Franklin has been described as a writer, a scientist, an inventor, a statesman, a diplomat, a printer, a publisher, a political philosopher, not to mention a kite flyer. And it's said that he had a great deal to do with the formation of the American character, the early American character, who we were as a nation. This is a picture probably depicting a 1600s delivery by a postal service man. This post road from Boston to New York was America's first mail route. It took roughly 2 weeks. It was about 18 inches wide. The trail was, they said, and snow and mud and running in the dark. It was very difficult. One person who traveled that route described it as very rocky, very bushy, and in many places miry. This probably depicts Paul Revere and his famous ride, but it's still kind of a cool picture of a messenger in those days. By 1875, that post road had been made suitable for stagecoach travel. Now, I want to mention at this point, everything in this presentation is from the point of view of the Europeans, the establishment and expansion of our American nation, and I fully realize that there are other stories and other points of view, but that's where the direction this is put together from. Out in the West, things were more primitive. They started early in the East, and they had things a little better organized, but out in the West, mail delivery was pretty primitive. You know, you're aware of the 49ers, the California 49ers, and the flock of gold miners that came to California at that time. And they didn't come out there to settle and make their homes. The vast majority of them came to mine for gold, make a fortune, and go home. And so they were very interested in letters, in mail, any kind of communication, newspapers, whatever they could get from back at home. In 1850, S.W. Langton worked out of Marysville, California. He had a list of over 1,000 miners who had commissioned him to pick up their mail and deliver it to the mining camps. And he did that. He charged $1 per letter, and he probably made more money than a lot of the people mining out there. But there were others doing the same kind of a thing. And this is the way it was carried, the jackass mail. Mules were extensively used, not only for mail delivery, but also for materials and things that needed to be delivered to the remote mining camps and the small towns. Most famous jackass mail was the one between San Antonio and San Diego in the 1850s, but George Chorpenning's mail delivery between Salt Lake City and Sacramento, California, which we'll talk a little more about later, also carried that designation. In the 1850s, stagecoach travel became popular and the mail was carried by stage. This is a great shot of a 6-horse rig, downtown Salt Lake City, in front of Charles W. Carter's studio there. Carter came to Salt Lake in 1859. He had been a member of the British Army, and that's where he learned to be a photographer. Cool picture of a 4-horse outfit with the riders on top. Now, stagecoach travel was not a picnic. It was no fun at all. The dust was intolerable. The roads were rough and bouncy. The food was awful often, and the water also. They got no sleep. And it was a rough way to travel. You had to want to get to where you were going. Young Sam Clemens describes a ride on top of a stagecoach, just as these folks in this picture are doing. Stagecoach magnate Ben Holiday. In the 1850s, he ran a network of stagecoaches in California, covering more than 2,500 miles of stagecoach trail. In the 1860s, later on, he established a stage line on the Central Overland Route, which comes pretty much straight across present-day Wyoming, largely paralleling Interstate 15 in Wyoming. John Butterfield was another big name in the stagecoach business in those days. Between 1858 and 61, Butterfield ran his stages on the Southern Overland Trail, a mail route in the South, and he is also the founder of American Express. We'll talk a little bit more about this Southern route and the Butterfield mail. So the Western migration was beginning at this time. Probably the first wagon train leaving for California was the Bartleson Bidwell group, who left in 1841 under Captain John Bartleson and John Bidwell. They started out with wagons. They started out accompanying Father Pierre de Smet and his missionaries who were Oregon bound, and they traveled together as far as Soda Springs, present-day Idaho, where the missionaries and some of Bartleson Bidwell's group left their wagons and traveled on and packed with pack trains to Oregon. They did not make California with their wagons. They got to the west or to the east slope of the Sierras, and they were required to leave them and go on with horses and mules. But they were probably the first wagon group to cross the South Pass, which was discovered in the white man's terms in 1812 by Robert Stewart, who was a fur trapper for John Jacob Astor and his company. In 1824, Jedediah Smith, the famous trapper and explorer, crossed South Pass from east to west, and he's the one that publicized it, started talking about it, began to let people know that this was a viable route for travel to the west, that you didn't have to fight the high mountains. If you want to chuckle, 1843 was called the year of the Great Migration because as many as 1,000 immigrants left for Oregon country, which was the place to be in those days. In 1847, between 1848 and 1869, about 250,000 people traveled over the immigrant trails to California. 1847, the Mormon pioneers came to Salt Lake Valley. And in 1852 alone, about 10,000 immigrants traveled into Utah Territory. The Mormon Trail is primarily on the north side of the Platte River for a couple of reasons. That allowed them to avoid confrontation with people that didn't like them. And plus the fact that the grass and the firewood on the south side of the Platte on the Oregon and California trails was just pretty well depleted. And many of the water holes were contaminated with cholera, so they took a slightly different route. Brigham Young was the leader of this operation. They started in 1847, and by 1860, there were more than 40,000 people in Utah Territory. Now, the quintessential Mormon immigration experience, what you see in all the depictions, is the handcart pioneers. Actually, there were only about 3,000 who came by handcart, and the others traveled by wagon or other means. But in any case, the rush was on. 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and about 80,000 would-be miners rushed to California in 1849. By 1860, there were about 350,000 people living there. In 1849, silver was discovered, the Comstock lode, Virginia City, Nevada, present-day Nevada. It was Utah Territory at the time. And anyway, it was called the granddaddy of all silver strikes. This is John Sutter, who owned the mill there in California, where the gold was found. Sutter was born in Switzerland, came to California in 1839. He became a Mexican citizen, got a nice land grant, and had a very prosperous farm and ranch operation going on there until James Marshall found gold at Coloma. Marshall came to California in 1848, and he was a carpenter, and he contracted with Sutter to build a sawmill at Coloma, and he's the one who discovered the gold in the mill in the tail race there. They tried to keep it quiet. Sutter knew what a mess it would make of his operation, but something like that couldn't be squelched, and pretty soon the rush was on in any case. And Sutter's Fort was located pretty much where Sacramento is now built. Point of all of this and the numbers of people that we're talking about is the need for faster mail service. The people in the West demanded to know what was going on. They were aware that civil war was a good possibility, and so they were very interested in mail from home and newspapers and news from home. George Chorpenning in 1851 started a monthly mail service from Salt Lake City to Sacramento, California, and started out with a partner, Absalom Woodward. Unfortunately, the partnership didn't last long. Woodward was killed by Indians out in the West Desert in that first winter. But Sharpening ran a monthly service, tried to run a monthly service between Salt Lake and Sacramento. To the east, from Salt Lake to the east, Brigham Young made several attempts to get mail service established. And names like Ephraim Hanks and Faramore's Little, they were the guys who tried to make that happen. Logistics and politics just seemed to shut him down time after time. We had a picture of John Butterfield and mentioned his Butterfield Overland stage. It followed a long, long route, what they called the Oxbow route because of its shape on the map, 25 days to San Francisco. The mail left from 2 points, the messengers left from 2 points, from St. Louis and from Memphis. They met at Fort Smith, Arkansas, and went south to El Paso, to Tucson and Yuma in present-day Arizona, and on to Los Angeles and San Francisco. And John Butterfield had the mail contract, which was very important politically as well as economically. Russell, Majors, and Waddell, the great freighters across the plains, in 1860 came up with a better idea. That was the Pony Express. They organized the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company as a subsidiary of Russell, Majors, and Waddell. Who actually came up with the idea is a matter of debate or speculation. It may have been Russell together with William Gwynn, a senator from California, who wanted to see his things in his state fostered rather. But in any case, the plan was to run horseback relays across the central route, that is, following the immigrant trails between St. Joseph, Missouri and Sacramento, California, and to do it in 10 days instead of 25 as Butterfield was taken. Now, when Russell proposed this to his partners, both said no. They said it's too expensive, it's way too risky. But he was a dreamer, and he was confident that they could wrest that mail contract from Butterfield and make this a profitable enterprise. And plus, he said that he had made commitments and promised that it would be done. And so, since his partners were honorable men, they honored his promises and went ahead and organized the Pony Express. This kind of shows the central route. You can't see much, but it follows the immigrant trails, starting out in Missouri from St. Joseph or St. Louis. Anyway, they followed the Platte River up into present-day Wyoming, and then the Sweetwater, and across South Pass and down across present-day Utah and Nevada and on to California. Russell, Majors, and Waddell. I'm sure these pictures are from later years after the Pony Express, but they're the founders. They're the ones that put this together. They had a major freighting empire in the western part of the United States, primarily hauling freight to army posts and forts across the West. At the height of they started in 1854, and at the height of their power, they owned 1,000 mules, 40,000 oxen, 3,500 wagons, and 4,000 employees. It was a huge enterprise. William H. Russell was the dreamer, the entrepreneur, and his dreams kind of got him into trouble. The company they did not get that fat mail contract. So the company was floundering. And in the winter of 1860, he got his hands on some bonds that he wasn't supposed to have, borrowed against them, got caught, ended up in jail on Christmas Day of 1860. And it was kind of all downhill from then. Alexander Majors was the freighter. He started out in 1848 hauling freight on the Santa Fe Trail, and he knew well how to make it run. Alexander Majors was also a very religious man, and he required all of his employees, Pony Express riders, bullwhackers, required them to take an oath that they would not drink intoxicating liquor, they would not use bad language, they would not abuse their livestock or fight with any of the other employees. Now, if you have any experience with mules, you can maybe question how successful they were with the with the no intoxicating liquor and no rough language part. In any case, William B. Waddell was the accountant, the money, the guy, the bean counter, the guy that kept track of the money, the least colorful and probably the least known of the three. The preparation. On the eastern end, back through present-day Kansas and Nebraska, the stations were established at small towns and road ranches, places that were pretty comfortable in any case. In the West, out here in our country, they built what they could build from logs, from adobe. They slapped up whatever they had. The horses, they probably used some blooded stock in the East. There was an advertisement in the newspaper back there at this time, at the time of the Pony Express, for 400 gray mares, not over 14 hands high, warranted sound, all the rest of that. I don't know who it was who had a thing for gray mares or why, but the horses, most of the horses used by the Pony Express were the Mustangs. They were available, they were inexpensive, they were tough. And excuse me, unable to handle the strain of what they were doing. The operation began in 1860, April 3rd, starting from St. Joseph and from Sacramento pretty much simultaneously. And it called for a 10-day delivery to Sacramento. They put all this together from inception to from the idea to the actual execution in about 6 weeks. The riders were young, tough, daring horsemen. All right, they had to be expert riders. They had to be very handy at that. Did I click back? No, we're not to the right. Yeah. Beg your pardon. As I said, it's been 10 years since I did the PowerPoint presentation. So they hired the riders, the young men, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Let's debug a myth at this point. Young, skinny, wiry fellows, orphans preferred. Okay, that's the vision that everybody has of the Pony Express riders. That's exactly what they were looking for, right? And exactly what they were. Not this advertisement was never seen by a prospective writer or an actual writer of 1860. This notice was printed first in Sunset Magazine in 1923, but it's such a romantic image. It's such a great idea. Everybody just grabbed onto it like crazy and held onto it. So if you have an opportunity not to perpetuate this piece of bull, okay. Pony Express mail. Letters were carried in a leather mochila, which was now that's a Spanish word, and it's what the Mexicans and the Spanish used for to ride their horses. They threw this leather piece over the saddle, and in this case, in the case of the Pony Express, there were 4 cantinas, pockets sewed into each corner. 3 of those were locked for the duration of the trip between Sacramento and St. Joseph, back and forth. Anyway, the left front pocket was called the way pocket, and station keepers at intervals along the trail had keys to that, so they could remove letters for Salt Lake City or for Camp Floyd and add letters that were to go on from there. Cost of a letter in 1860 was $5 per half ounce. Now, it was later, about a year later, it was reduced to about $1, but still a tremendously high price in that day. And the speculation is that there was probably no junk mail carried by Pony Express. You can kind of guess that. This is a depiction of the Pony Express mochila. In the movies, they're usually passing saddlebags back and forth. This was a whole different system. The rider sat right on the mail pouch, and it was possible to get bucked off, but you couldn't drop it otherwise. They used a lightweight stripped down saddle, not much more than the tree and the rigging and the stirrups, and the leather seat was provided by the mochila. And as we said, the three pockets were locked all the way through. The left front is where they were able to take letters or remove letters or add letters as they went along. An example of a Pony Express letter carried in November of 1860. And as it says there, this was announcing the news of Lincoln's election, bound for Julesburg, Colorado, to present day Colorado. And it's for the Rocky Mountains out by Denver. There were two types of stations operated by and for the Pony Express. Home stations were located at 50 to 100 mile intervals, and that's where the riders stayed between their mail runs. The swing stations or the relay stations were located at 10 to 20 mile intervals, kind of often depending on terrain and water availability. And the riders changed horses at those swing stations, and they were expected to do that in 2 minutes or less. Gives you just about time to take that mochila from the tired horse, throw it on the fresh one, maybe get a drink of water, and keep moving on. And the way it ran, a rider worked back and forth, shuttled back and forth between his two home stations. For example, out in Nevada country there, a rider might have left Cold Spring Station in central Nevada and switched horses, changed horses at the swing stations as he rode west until about Bucklands or Fort Churchill, wherever the station was at the time. At that point, he would turn that mail pouch over to a westbound rider, and he'd wait there, live there at that station for a day or two until the eastbound mail came back, and then he'd carry it back to Cold Springs and camp out there until the next westbound run. That's the way they made it work. This is an example of a really kind of a classy example of a home station. Salt Lake House, downtown Salt Lake City. Sir Richard Burton, the famous British explorer, didn't find a whole lot of good to say about stuff in the West. He thought it was rough, too rustic, too dirty, too crappy. Anyway, when he visited Salt Lake House in 1860, his impression here was different. He said he had not seen aught so grand in many a day. Burton stayed here, young Sam Clemens also, and it was a classy place to stay. It was a showpiece that Brigham Young wanted for people traveling through Salt Lake City. Kind of the other end of the spectrum is Ruby Valley Station, which was in Ruby Valley, obviously out in present day Nevada. And it's basically just a series of rows of vertical posts stuck into the ground with a makeshift roof and a stone chimney. This building has been moved to Elko, to the Northeastern Nevada Museum up there in Elko, which is a great museum. And you can visit this Pony Express station just outside the building. It's worth the trip there. These are the guys that made it happen. Benjamin Ficklin was the general superintendent on the route. It was divided into 5 divisions. A.E. Lewis was in charge from St. Joseph, Missouri to Fort Kearny. Joseph Slade from just west of Fort Kearny, Platte Station to Horseshoe Creek. James Bromley from just east of there to Salt Lake City. Howard Eagan took over just south of Salt Lake. Ranter was in charge as far as Roberts Creek in present day Nevada. Boulevard Roberts from Grub Wells on to Sacramento. There's Benjamin F. Ficklin. And obviously he was a kind of a dandy, but he was a very effective organizer. And he had a lot to do with putting things together properly and getting him started and getting him running. After the beginning of the Pony Express, he didn't stay around a great long time. He left and went to work on a telegraph project. When the Civil War was underway, he went east and became an official in the Confederacy, in the Confederate government. don't have Lewis in here. I've never seen a picture of Mr. Lewis. He was apparently one of the least colorful anyway, and then there's not much known about A.E. Lewis, who ran the eastern end. Joseph Slade, on the other end, this is a character. Around Julesburg, present-day Colorado, the stage company and the Pony Express, they were having a very difficult time with the theft of livestock. A lot of stock was disappearing. So they hired Joseph Slade to clean things up. Slade went out and kind of traced the problem to the station keeper there, Jules Benny. Sometimes you see Jules Rennie. Anyway, Slade and Benny got into a confrontation, and Benny shot Slade and wounded him pretty severely. But Slade holed up and recovered. And when he had recovered, he went back. When he caught Jules Benny, as the story goes, he tied him to a fence post and used him for target practice. When Jules was dead, as the story goes, Slade cut off his ear and put it in his pocket for a souvenir. As they say, he was the consummate gentleman when he was sober, mild-mannered, polite to a fault, and hell on wheels when he'd been drinking. Just a few years after the run of the Pony Express, he was caught by vigilantes in Virginia City, Montana, and they hanged him up there. James Bromley. He's often credited among the organizers of the Pony Express, and he very likely was. He came to Utah territory, to the Weber area in 1854, where he ran several businesses. He had a hotel and a store and blacksmith shop and various other things, including the well-known Weber Stage and Pony Express station. Major Howard Eagan, born in Ireland. He was a scout for the 1847 Vanguard Company of Mormon Pioneers under Brigham Young. He pioneered, and the title major is one that he acquired. He was a major in the Nauvoo Legion back in Illinois, and he hung on to that. He used that title throughout his life. He pioneered a route across central Nevada, present-day Nevada anyway, part of which was used by the Pony Express when they came along. The rest was pioneered by Captain James Simpson out of Camp Floyd. Howard Eagan was pretty well known to have been the oldest Pony Express rider. He was 46 years old when it started in 1860. And all the leaders, all the big bosses said, the guys coming from the east will make much better time than the riders coming from the west because of the mountains, the desert, the Sierras, all of that. It's going to slow them down, and they will run behind. So they stationed their rider in Salt Lake City to take that first mail on west. Howard Eagan, his thought was, my boys can ride with anybody, and they're not going to be behind. So he himself was waiting out at Meadow Creek out in Rush Valley for the eastbound mail. And when it came through on April 7th, 1860, he's the one who brought it from there, running in relays as we described back to Salt Lake City. I don't know whether he rode at other times, but that's documented. On the far west end was Bolivar Roberts. He came west in 1850. And in California, he hired riders, bought horses, built stations. They describe working out in what is now Nevada, making adobes with water alkaline, so strongly that it blistered their feet as they tramped that mud to make adobe bricks. After the run of the Pony Express, he became a mining engineer and was quite an influential man in the West. The station keepers. Station keeper didn't have it too bad back in the East because they were road ranch owners or in the cities, someplace like Seneca, Kansas, where the hotel was a station, and it was a comfortable enough life. It was just an addition to their regular duties. Out in the West, things were considerably rougher. The riders drew less attention. The the station keepers drew less attention than the riders. The riders were moving and they were young and colorful. Station guys were kind of hung out to dry there. Their conditions were often lonely and harsh. All of their supplies often had to be hauled to them, including water. They were vulnerable to attack by the Indians, and during the Paiute War in Nevada, present day Nevada, in early 1860, several of them were lost. This is Garrett Hollenberg. Hollenberg was born in Germany, and he came to Kansas Territory in 1854, where he established a successful road ranch. Successful and prosperous road ranch, and that's where the company established their Pony Express station. They called it Cottonwood Station. The building is still standing. It's been stabilized and interpreted as a state park, and it's well worth a visit there in kind of north central Kansas along the Pony Express Trail. David McCandless. Was he an outlaw, the leader of a notorious gang of thieves and ruffians, or was he just a guy in the wrong place at the wrong time? McCandless was not actually the station keeper at Rock Creek there in Nebraska. The station manager was a guy named Horace Wellman, but McCandless owned the land and the buildings. July of 1861, the company hired a young guy, 23-year-old James Hickok. And Hickok was kind of a different guy. He had a long sloping nose and kind of poochy lips. And they teased him, probably including McCandless. They teased him and they called him Duck Bill. Obviously, you wouldn't like it. At some point along there, during the summer of 1861, Hickok and McCandless got into an argument over some unpaid rent or some such, and Hickok ended up killing David McCandless and his brother and another one. And whether it was self-defense or whether it was murder depends on whose side of the story you're listening to. But from that point on, they didn't call him Duck Bill anymore. They called him Wild Bill. There he is. James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok. He went on from that point to become a famous, very well-known frontier lawman, and was playing cards in 1876 in Deadwood, South Dakota, where he was shot in the back by Jack McCall. They said the cards that he was holding in his hand at the time were aces and eights, and that is still called the dead man's hand to this day. Judge William A. Carter came to Wyoming Territory in 1857 with Johnston's army. He became a judge. He was a storekeeper. He ran the post office. He had a lot to do there at Fort Bridger area. He's the guy responsible for Utah's unusual shape on the map. Wyoming was granted statehood before Utah was, and Judge Carter didn't want his state to have an odd shape on the map. So he took a chunk of ours to make his square, and we got a little step in the northeast corner there. Orrin Porter Rockwell, one of the most notorious guys out in this country in that day. He was a bodyguard to Joseph Smith back in Illinois. He served as a bodyguard to Brigham Young after that. He was a feared and legendary lawman across the West, a relentless pursuer, totally fearless. He wore his hair long like that because it said that Joseph Smith promised him, as long as he never cut his hair, like Samson, bullet or knife would never take his life. And he died in bed, in fact, but he was a legend, and he was fearsome. And whether he was a horrendous murderer or a great defender of his faith and of the law, there again, it depends on which side of the story you're getting. But there are some stories about him to justify the legend that he carried. The riders of the Pony Express, they came from all over the country. They were quite a motley crew. They came from all over the country. They came from the US, from Canada, from Europe, and most of them were in their late teens and early 20s. They were young, skinny, wiry fellows. They kind of had to be. Their instructions were to outrun Indians and road agents rather than to fight them. And the turnover was pretty high. Not everybody could stand up to the pounding that ride took. What did they wear? What did they look like? The books say they wore a red shirt like mine, blue jeans, got that too, a slouch hat probably. My feeling is they probably wore, okay, back in the East, Johnny Frye and those guys, they lived at Patey House and they were celebrities. They were very popular. So they probably wore a red shirt and a sash and whatever it took to kind of set themselves off and make themselves look good. Out here in the West, I'm guessing they wore what they had. If it was buckskin, if it was homespun, whatever they had, whatever it took. How were they armed? The books say they were issued a 36 caliber Navy Colt pistol. Once again, I'm thinking out here in the West, they probably carried whatever they had, whatever was available. Books say they started out with a rifle and a horn to blow as they were approaching the stations. Those were soon discarded if they were used at all. They were issued a Bible and took the oath that we mentioned, Alexander Major's oath, to be good guys, not to be rough guys. And each one was issued a Bible. Each employee of Major's was issued a Bible, and they were instructed to use the Bible all the time, use the gun, the pistol, only when necessary. This is Johnny Frye. He has probably the best claim for being the first rider out of St. Joseph. He was 20 years old when the Pony Express started. Johnny, he was a popular dude. And legend is, you can take this for whatever it's worth. Legend is that a girl who had a great crush on Johnny Frye invented the donut. She cooked up a donut and she would sprint up alongside him as he was riding and hand him this donut, and he could hold it on his finger and eat it as he rode. Now, I'm sure it happened just that way, right? Johnny Frye was 20 years old in 1860. In 63, he was killed in Kansas by a raid of William Quantrell and his band. Jack Keetley was born in England. He was 18 years old in 1860. And he rode in various sections up and down the trail, mostly to the east. It's said that he once rode 340 miles in 31 hours. And the little town of Keetley, just north of Park City, Utah, is named in his honor. Rass Eagan, Richard Erastus Eagan. This is a son of Howard Eagan, who we talked a little bit about. Rass Eagan was 18 years old. He had a favorite horse that he called Miss Lightning, and they said that they rode 22 miles in an hour and 5 minutes, and that's cooking for the whole distance. He took a little time off to get married during the run of the Pony Express. Elijah Nicholas Wilson. This is the guy that wrote the book. When he was 8 or 9 years old, or 10, he was living with his family here in Grantsville, Utah, where I live. Utah Territory then, and he was assigned to herd the sheep up on the bench to the south, and he hated it. It was boring. He was up there by himself. Well, there was a band of Shoshone Indians that wintered in the valley, and he got friendly with the Indian boys and probably learned to speak some of their language. And one spring, when they were about ready to leave, they said, "See that pony right there? Go with us and you can have it. It's yours." So he went. And he lived with the Shoshone for about 2 years before coming back, and later became a Pony Express rider in 1860. The hat that he's wearing, he had some adventures. This one did. The hat that he's wearing, they said he wore that hat indoors and out the rest of his life, because in the middle of his forehead, was a deep scar from an Indian arrow that he received during the time of the Pony Express. The little town of Wilson, Wyoming, just up the hill from Jackson Hole, is named in Nick Wilson's honor. Pony Bob Haslam was probably the most famous of the Pony Express riders. He was born in England. He was 20 years old in 1860. He has a pretty good claim for having made the longest ride of any rider in 380 miles in 36 hours, if the stories are true. And he rode in other Pony Express type enterprises after this one was done. I just threw this in because not all the riders were quite as dapper as Rass Eagan. Some of them were kind of rough looking dudes, and they had to be to live the life that they lived. All good things come to an end, and this legend came to a close. The transcontinental telegraph was completed in October 24th, 1861, and the thunder of the Pony Express hoofs bowed to the lightning of the telegraph. Transcontinental Railroad, in 1869, they say that is said to be the end, the official end of the pioneer era. The telephone in 1914. It's been a steady cascade of technology from that telegraph right down to the instant messaging of today. And things have changed. This is Samuel F.B. Morse. He was an artist. He was a painter, and apparently a pretty good one. But he was also an inventor. He invented a type of electronic telegraph, and he developed the Morse code that was used for sending messages by telegraph. William Henry Jackson must have loved the Pony Express. He put it in a lot of his paintings, and this writer is saluting the guys putting up the telegraph poles that are going to put him out of a job. The steam trains, as we said, in 1869, and as stated, that was said to be the official end of the pioneer era, when the trains were running across the country, and mail and material and passengers could be carried faster and cheaper. The rock there on the right, incidentally, it was called Pulpit Rock. This is Echo, Utah. And that was a major landmark up there at Echo. During the First World War, it was taken down by the railroad for fear that saboteurs could blow that up and block the railroad and stop the passage of the trains from east to west. There's a picture from 1914 as the telephone line was completed at the Utah-Nevada border. In retrospect, Pony Express was largely forgotten for about 50 years. No lists of riders, no company business records, none of that. None of those records are known to exist. And the first book written about the Pony Express didn't come until after the turn of the century, into the 20th century. But it's still remembered, and it's still famous and beloved around the world, all right? And why was it forgotten? Well, the Civil War was beginning just as this was coming to a close, and then that was big news, and everybody turned their attention to that and recorded what was happening and paid attention there, and just Pony kind of slipped into the background. Although Buffalo Bill Cody, bless his heart, a lot of historians don't accept or aren't too high on his claim to have been a Pony Express rider. He was a messenger for Russell, Majors, and Waddell on their wagon trains, but whether he actually rode for the pony, that's debated. And some of the things that Prentice Ingram wrote about him definitely are fanciful. But he included the Pony Express riders in every one of his Wild West shows, and so he had a lot to do with keeping that memory alive. And as I said, it is still remembered and loved around the world. In Western Europe, they do a Pony Express reenactment, which they've been conducting for more than 35 years. And that's one of my favorite stories, but it's a story for another time. 1993, Congress established the Pony Express National Historic Trail. And what's going on today is done by my group, the National Pony Express Association. We were incorporated in California in 1978 with the purpose to identify, to mark, and re-ride the Pony Express Trail, which we've been doing with 42 successful re-rides of that trail. We work closely with the National Park Service, who administers the trail, and also with the Bureau of Land Management out here in the West, because much of the trail runs across BLM administered lands, public lands. We do parades. We give presentations to school classes and Boy Scout groups and other things such as this. There's a couple of states that do a Christmas card ride, just whatever we can do to keep this memory alive, to keep this. We do our annual re-ride in June each year, 500 or more riders leapfrogging over 1,900 miles, and we do it in 10 days. And rather than 500 riders taking the whole, that's not happening. Each state takes care of their own territory. Utah riders carry the mail across Utah, turn it over to Nevada riders who take it on and give it to California riders. That's the way it's run. These are the logos of the National Pony Express Association and National Park Service, what they put on the historic trail. Postscript. Did my ancestor ride for the Pony Express? We hear this quite often. Someone will step up and say, the family legend has always been that my great, how many greats grandfather rode for the Pony Express, but I don't find him in any of the rider lists or any of the information. How do you explain that? Well, a couple of things. There were other Pony Expresses in California. Just to mention, the towns of Petaluma and Nevada City, if not others, ran a little spur Pony Express from Sacramento out to their town in order to get the news as quickly as they could. There was Pony Express run between Virginia City and Reno, I think as late as 1869. And in other places across the West, the mail was carried on horseback, which makes them Pony Express riders, even though they weren't part of the Russell, Majors, and Waddell operation. And also, some of these old grandfathers, like me, maybe our memory improves as we get older and they start thinking, gosh, it really would have been cool if I could have been a Pony Express rider. And the more I think about it, maybe I was. That could account for some of those stories. In yellow there is the website of the National Pony Express Association. There's a list of riders on there. If you want to look, of a couple hundred people who claim to have ridden, all right, or who were purported to have ridden. The bottom website is the National Museum, the Pony Express Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri, the stables there. And they also have a list. Now, the one on our website, at least there's some citation of where those names were found. I don't know that the names on the Pony Express stables website are vetted in any way. And as far as memories, there's an interesting book, a fun book called Orphans Preferred by a guy named Christopher Corbett. Chris is a great guy and a very entertaining author. That's a fun book. But he was doing research for his book, interviewing some of our people as he traveled across the West. He interviewed a man named Augie Bjorklund, one of our riders, and Augie told him this: Mr. Corbett, out here we don't lie. We just remember big. Thank you. I'm out of material unless somebody has a question. And I would be happy to answer any question. If I don't know the answer, I'll do my best to make up something at least as interesting.
Well, thank you. That was really good. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the class. If you'd like to unmute your microphone, but please leave your camera off because we are recording. And if you'd like to ask our guests a question, this is the time to do so.
Put them all to sleep, Sue?
No. Sometimes they're just a little shy, so I'll get the question started. I have noticed in genealogical research, I frequently, especially like back in the 1850s era and afterwards, of course, as well, but I often see like my ancestor's name in classified ads in the old newspapers saying unclaimed letters. I've often wondered during this time period before the railroad and such, when letters were coming from the East Coast to the West Coast, how did these letters, once they got there by Pony Express, I don't think the Pony Express went to every town all over California, Nevada, and Utah. So I would assume that there was a way to redistribute the mail once it got to a certain point. Are you familiar with that?
Well, I mentioned S.W. Langton, who took letters to the California goldfields, and there were a number of others that did the very same thing. The Pony Express didn't get the response because of the expense, didn't get the response that it probably deserved from the people. More letters were sent east from California than were sent west, where it was easier, where there were more established mail services. But I imagine by the time they got there, everything was up to the local people. The majority, more than any other user of the Pony Express, was the U.S. government, the Army, sending government dispatches to places like Camp Floyd and Fort Churchill and on west. So that doesn't really answer your question, does it?
Well, I was just wondering, because obviously they had to get to a post office, so the post office could put in the newspaper that there were unclaimed letters to notify people to come pick up their letters. So there obviously wasn't a delivery service. I was just wondering, because some of these places were very desolate, and I was just wondering, just out of curiosity more than anything else, how the letters were redistributed.
Possibly just that way, that the people came to pick up their mail from the outlying ranches and outlying towns, or somebody came for the outlying towns, or people like Langdon were commissioned to carry those letters and find the owners, the recipients.
It kind of puts a whole new spin when I see my old ancestors' names in those unclaimed letters. I never thought for a moment, how did they get from one point to the other? I just know that, obviously they thought they were living there because there's these unclaimed letters.
Well, this was pretty much localized, just, the delivery along the trail.
I see in the chat box, Karen said, we were driving across Highway 50 on Tuesday and I saw a marker for the Pony Express Trail.
Yes.
Are you is your organization responsible for the markers?
Well, I'll tell you what we've done here in Utah, and I think they're doing that. Yes, I would say yes. And here's the way that works. We work very closely with the National Park Service. And for us here in Utah, some graphic designers at the Park Service office in Santa Fe, in Aaron Marr's office, have developed the signs and a sign plan where those signs should be placed on the trail, or whether the trail is crossing the highway or whatever. Anyway, they've made the signs. Our group goes out and installs them, often with local help, with support from counties and local organizations. So I would think probably yes. I can't say for sure, but I know the people out of Ely have gotten very active in installing those signs along the trail in Nevada.
Jean put in the chat box, nice presentation and enhanced with your outfit, traditional red shirt Pony Express riders wore. So that didn't go unnoticed.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you very much.
Now, I noticed you showed a picture of Brigham Young. I did not know he was a Mason, but in your picture, he clearly is wearing a Mason's pin.
It was very, yeah, he was. So was Joseph Smith, the founder, the prophet of the Mormon Church. It was pretty prevalent back in Nauvoo, and some of that was brought west. There's no particular contact, no crosstalk, as far as I know, between today between the Masons. I mean, there is no reason why members of one group can't belong to another, but I don't know of any connection between the two in this day. In that day, a lot of those early Mormon leaders were Masons, were Freemasons.
Oh, that's so interesting. I've read several books on how to identify, especially if you don't know who's in the picture, how to identify and what to, to clue in little clues here and there. And of course, my eye instantly went to that Freemason pin in that photograph. Tracy in the chat box would like to know, were there any women riders or station masters?
Excellent question. In 1978, National Geographic put an article in their National Geographic magazine, and they also did a really thorough study of whatever they could find on Pony Express history. They found no evidence that there were any women who were riders. You know, it just wasn't done socially in that day. It just wasn't acceptable for women at that time in that society to do something like that. Now, our association, we have a lot of women, and a lot of them are excellent contributors. Our national president at present is Pam Dixon down in California.
You mentioned, let's see here. You showed a picture of the letter with the stamp on it.
Yes.
It's funny. I've often heard of Pony Express stamps. You know, in fact, my uncle who recently passed away had a collection of Pony Express stamps, and I always thought it was like a stamp. You know, like a 3-cent stamp or a 2-cent stamp. I didn't realize it was literally a stamp.
Both are true. Later on, Wells Fargo got involved, either at least as agents. And later on in 1861, on into the spring and summer of 1861, they did have a little frank stamp that was attached, that was affixed to the letters. But in the early days, it was just, I don't know how they collected their money.
George says in the chat box, I have 2 questions. Do you have Mormon pioneer ancestors who came to Utah early on? And have you been personally to the Pony Express Museum in St. Joseph?
Yes, to both. And one of my family lines is the Despain line, and they came before the railroad. Came to Utah before the railroad. And yes, we have been to the Pony Express stables. There are 2 fabulous Pony Express museums. Well, yes, in St. Joseph, Missouri. One is Patey House Museum, which was the eastern terminus. That's where the riders stayed and where the mail apparently left from. And that's just up the hill from the Pony Express stables, which is a marvelous interpretation, tremendously informative and extremely well done.
Now, you showed a picture of Wild Bill. I personally have been to Deadwood, and I've seen Wild Bill and Calamity Jane's plots, their cemetery plots, and went to the museums in Deadwood, saw his guns and all the other wonderful heirlooms that they have from Wild Bill. But it kind of made me think about, you mentioned about no Pony Express riders being women. It made me think of Calamity Jane, how she dressed as a man and supposedly masqueraded as a man in the army before they got to Deadwood.
If there's an answer, I don't know it. When was Calamity Jane born?
Hold on, I can look that up. And while I'm looking it up, it's a follow-up question. Karen says in the chat box, supposedly there was a woman dressed as a man out of Truckee, but I forgot his or her name. And let me look up, while you're answering that, let me look up Calamity Jane.
Karen, if you can track that down, I'd be really interested in knowing, because it's new information. It's something I don't know, and something that's not generally known. So if you can find out anything about that and find us some documentation, it would be a service.
Calamity Jane was born in 1852, so obviously too young to ever be a Pony Express rider, but certainly she was known to be, you know, a woman who dressed in man's clothing.
Okay. Yeah, she would not have ridden at 8 years old.
Yeah, obviously. Let's see here. I'm looking through the chat box. Let's see here. Kathy says she really enjoyed the presentation. Karen says she's going to look for that woman's name and get back to you.
Yeah, I'd love to hear anything on that. Very much, Karen. Thank you.
She says it's one of her Tahoe books.
Okay.
And then let's see here. So one of my questions was, were there any personnel records? But you addressed that already, so I'm going to cross that one off. One of the things in Virginia City, and also all of Nevada, actually, for that matter, we have a wonderful free access to old digitized newspapers, like from Virginia City and in Reno and Carson City back, from the 1800s. And I'm just wondering, what a wonderful project that would be for the Nevada State Genealogical Association to maybe kind of like drill into these newspapers and find out more information about, the Pony Express, if it hasn't already been done. I mean, I guess I can do a bibliographic search and find out if it's already been done, but it sounds like it would be a really fun project. I mean, now I'm kind of really interested in the Pony Express.
It would be, that would be fascinating.
Yeah. And then I'm going to look also after we're done today, I'm going to look to see if we have that book called Orphans Preferred, because you said that sounds like a really good book to read.
It's fun.
Let's
It
see.
does a fair amount of debunking, he says this is history and this is not in a lot of cases.
Well, isn't that the truth with so much of Western, history? A lot of it is more lore than it is history itself.
Yeah, it is true. And this was an easily romanticized episode.
Absolutely. Well, class, I've gone through all my questions. What about you? Anybody in the class have any last minute questions? Unmute your microphone if you'd like, or put it in the chat box if you'd like. Give it another few seconds.
Well, I hope that was worth your time, folks. Thank you very much for listening in.
Oh, George just wrote down, I enjoyed the part in pointing out the romanticized part of the 1923 poster. Many historical events experienced similar things. Okay, I'll give just a few more moments, class. If you have a question, you can unmute your microphone. Want to make sure everyone gets time in to ask their questions.
I have no questions because I had no Pony Express ancestors.
Oh, okay, Marlene. Well, it sure puts a new spin on those letters left at the post office for me, at least. So, okay, well, Pat, if there's no other questions, before I say goodbye to you, I want to let the class know we're going to go on for another hour or two. Just as long as the class wants to stay, we'll continue with the class. A lot of times it goes until 4 o'clock. Sometimes it doesn't. But everyone's welcome to stay, including you, Pat, if you'd like. You're more than welcome to stay and kind of experience the second half of our class. For anybody who'd like to leave at this point, and before you do, I want to say thank you to Pat. That was an excellent presentation. And thank you, Pat, for letting us record today. It will take a little bit of time for our marketing department to get it posted onto our YouTube channel. But once it is, I'll be happy to notify you. And if you'd like, you can go back and watch it. And please spread the word about our class. If you know of any other guest speakers who'd be interested in presenting history through the genealogical genre, so to speak. So we really enjoyed today's presentation. And at this point, I will stop the recording. And before anyone leaves, if there's anything in the chat box that you want, grab it before you leave, because if you log out and then forget the chat box, you want to go back and grab it when you log in, the chat box will not be there. So please grab anything out of the chat box that you want right now. And you can do that one of two ways. You can either just copy and paste whatever you want out of the chat box into an email and then email it to yourself, or you can click on the 3 little dots at the bottom of the chat box, and that will download everything in the chat box to your computer. So with that, I will say thank you, Pat. We really enjoyed it, and I will stop the recording at this point in time.